The rope that held. The hemp rope stretches across the void like a lifeline between worlds, one end secured to a blasted tree stump on Hacksaw Ridge, the other disappearing into the darkness 300 feet below, where medics wait with stretchers. Each strand bears the weight of impossible choices, and Desmond Doss can feel every fibre trembling as another wounded man descends into safety. The rope had appeared almost by accident. A supply drop gone wrong, cargo scattered across the plateau when Japanese mortars found their range. Most of the gear was lost or destroyed, but Sergeant Howell had spotted the coiled hemp line among the wreckage and dragged it to the cliff edge. Nobody expected it would become their salvation. Now, 6 hours after the 77th Infantry Division's assault crumbled under withering fire, the rope represents the only connection between hell and hope. The dawn attack on Okinawa's most fortified position had lasted exactly 14 minutes before dissolving into chaos. Men had stumbled back over the cliff in whatever formation panic allowed, leaving their wounded scattered across the coral-strewn plateau like broken dolls. "That's 15 down, Doss," the rope singing like a violin string. "How many more you figure are up there?" Desmond doesn't answer Howell immediately. His raw palms still burn from the last lowering, and somewhere beyond the ridge's smoking lip, another voice calls weakly for a medic. The sound cuts through artillery thunder and settles in his chest like a physical weight. "Hard to say, Sergeant. Could be a dozen, could be more." The other men watch him with expressions he's learned to read over months of combat, part admiration, part disbelief, part guilt. These are soldiers who'd questioned his courage during training, whispered that a man who wouldn't carry a rifle had no business in a rifle company. Some had called him coward, others figured his religious convictions were just elaborate cover for yellow. None of them had expected him to be the first volunteer when Captain Glover asked who would go back for the wounded. "Most of the Japs pulled back to their caves," Howell continues, testing the rope's anchor point around the tree stump. "But they've got observers, snipers. Soon as they see movement up there, they'll zero in." Desmond adjusts his aid bag. Tourniquets, morphine, bandages, all running dangerously low after the day's work. Each item represents a life he might save, a prayer he might answer. The irony isn't lost on him that in refusing to take lives, he's found himself in the business of preserving them under the most impossible circumstances. Private Morrison limps over, his left arm in an improvised sling. He'd been one of Desmond's loudest critics during the transport to Okinawa, constantly needling him about Bible reading and prayer time. Now Morrison's face carries something approaching reverence. "Doc, what you're doing up there? Nobody expected this. Not from..." Morrison doesn't finish the sentence, but Desmond understands. Not from the Seventh-day Adventist who reads scripture during artillery barrages. Not from the medic who won't touch a rifle. Not from the soft-spoken kid from Virginia who seems too gentle for this war. The rope groans in the wind, and Desmond finds himself studying each strand as if reading the future. Will it hold for another man? The hemp shows dangerous wear, fibers splitting, darkened with blood and rain. But somehow it continues to bear weight that should be impossible. "Listen," Howell says quietly. "Captain's orders are to pull back the perimeter in 1 hour. After that, you're on your own up here. Nobody's asking you to stay, but nobody's ordering you down either." From the crater field beyond the ridge, another voice rises above the distant rattle of machine guns. Weak, desperate, human. Desmond closes his eyes and feels the familiar knot of terror in his stomach. Every instinct screams at him to retreat with the others, to let someone else take the risk. Instead, he checks his medical supplies one more time and looks toward the path he's memorized through 3 previous trips. 50 yards along the collapsed communication trench, then across open ground where artillery has churned coral into powder, finally to the maze of shell holes where wounded men wait in whatever cover they can find. The rope waits beside him, patient as prayer. In the growing darkness of Hacksaw Ridge, it has become more than equipment. It's a covenant between the living and the dying, between faith and action, between the frightened young man they'd underestimated and the exhausted soldiers who now watch him with something approaching awe. Below them, the lights of the aid station flicker like distant stars. Above, the plateau stretches away into smoke and shadows, holding its secrets close. And somewhere in between, a simple hemp line continues to bridge the gap between hell and hope, one wounded soul at a time. If stories like this make you imagine what you'd do under fire, tell us in the comments how you think you'd react in this situation. And stay with us for the next chapters. The path across Hacksaw Ridge's shattered plateau has become as familiar to Desmond as the hallways of his childhood home, though infinitely more dangerous. Each shell crater, each fallen tree, each fold in the coral-strewn ground tells a story of the morning's failed assault. The 77th Infantry Division had expected tough resistance. Okinawa's defenders had turned every ridge into a fortress, but nobody had prepared for the interlocking fields of fire that greeted them at dawn. Now, crawling through the maze of destruction, Desmond moves by memory and prayer. The Japanese positions remain largely invisible. Cave mouths hidden in coral outcropping, spider holes camouflaged with vegetation, machine gun nests carved deep into the ridge's reverse slope. But he can feel eyes watching from the darkness, calculating distance and opportunity. The wounded man he seeks lies near a destroyed supply dump, his voice growing weaker with each passing minute. Private Gomez had been caught in the open when mortars started falling, and the explosion that dropped him had scattered equipment across 30 yards of ground. Now he's wedged beneath an overturned supply crate, conscious but losing blood from shrapnel wounds in his chest and shoulder. Doc didn't think anybody was coming back. "I'm here," Desmond whispers, already working to expose the wounds. "We're getting you home." The work requires total concentration, stopping bleeding, administering morphine, preparing Gomez for the agonizing journey back. But part of his mind stays fixed on the rope waiting at the cliff edge. Each man he's lowered has tested those hemp fibers a little more, stretched them closer to their breaking point. How many more times can they trust their lives to strands that were never meant for this kind of work? As he fashions a tourniquet from Gomez's torn equipment straps, Japanese voices echo from nearby positions. Flashlights probe the darkness, searching for the American who keeps appearing and vanishing like a ghost. The enemy has noticed the pattern, wounded men disappearing from the plateau, the sound of something being lowered over the cliff edge in the darkness. Twice during the return journey, they freeze in place as enemy patrols pass within yards of their hiding spots. Gomez bites down on a folded bandage to muffle his groans, while Desmond presses his face into the mud and prays with an intensity that makes his hands shake. The smell of cordite and wet earth fills his nostrils, mixing with the metallic scent of blood and the acrid smoke that drifts endlessly across the ridge. At the cliff edge, Howell and 2 privates help secure Gomez in the improvised rope harness they've rigged from equipment straps and cargo webbing. The hemp line stretches ominously as they begin lowering him into the void below, and Desmond holds his breath while counting each foot of descent. "Rope's talking to us, Doc," one of the privates mutters. "Listen to it sing." The sound is unmistakable, individual fibers snapping under strain, the groan of hemp stretched beyond safe limits. But somehow, the line holds, as it has for 15 previous evacuations. Far below, lights signal that Gomez has reached the bottom safely, that hands are already working to transfer him to a stretcher and carry him toward the aid station. "That's 16 men, Doss," Howell says, as they haul the empty harness back up. 16 souls who'd be dead without that rope. But Desmond is already listening for more voices from the darkness. Somewhere out there, other wounded men are counting the minutes, wondering if anyone remembers they exist. The rational part of his mind knows the rope can't hold forever. that each evacuation brings them closer to catastrophic failure. Yet the covenant remains unbroken. Each time he secures the line around the tree stump, checks the anchor point, tests the tension, he feels the weight of responsibility settling across his shoulders like a familiar pack. These men didn't choose their wounds, didn't ask to be left behind when the assault collapsed. They simply need someone to remember that their lives matter, that no mission is complete while they lie bleeding in the darkness. The perimeter begins its gradual withdrawal as Captain Glover's deadline approaches. Men file past the cliff edge in small groups, their faces mixing exhaustion with guilt. Some nod to Desmond as they pass. Others avoid his eyes, knowing they're leaving him to continue work they're not willing to share. "You don't have to stay," Morrison tells him quietly. Nobody would think less. Desmond adjusts his aid bag and checks his remaining supplies. 3 tourniquets, 2 morphine syrettes, handful of bandages, enough for maybe 2 more men, if he's careful and lucky. "Long as that rope holds and there's wounded up here, I reckon I'll stay." The rope waits in the darkness, patient and faithful. Each strand tells the same story, that sometimes the greatest strength lies not in what you're willing to destroy, but in what you're determined to preserve. The plateau falls silent except for the distant murmur of wind through shattered trees and the occasional crack of a sniper's rifle echoing across the coral ridges. With the perimeter withdrawn, Hacksaw Ridge belongs to the darkness, the hidden Japanese positions, and one unarmed medic who refuses to abandon the wounded, scattered across its scarred surface. Desmond crouches beside the rope, testing each strand with fingers that have learned to read hemp like scripture. The fibers feel different now, softer, stretched, some beginning to unravel where friction has worn them thin. 16 men have trusted their lives to this improvised lifeline, and each evacuation has brought them closer to the moment when physics overcomes faith. But from somewhere near the ridge's far edge, another voice calls weakly through the smoke. The sound pierces his exhaustion and settles in his chest with familiar weight. Just one more. The phrase has become his prayer, his compass, his curse. After each evacuation, he tells himself he'll make one final trip across the killing field. Just one more wounded man to find and lower to safety. Then another voice calls from the darkness, and the covenant begins again. The latest casualty is Corporal Zhang from 2nd Platoon, pinned beneath a fallen communications antenna when Japanese mortars targeted their command post. Zhang's legs are crushed, and dark stains spread across the ground beneath the twisted metal. But he's conscious, alert, and desperate enough to keep calling for help, despite knowing the sound might draw enemy fire. Working by touch in the near-total darkness, Desmond administers morphine and applies pressure bandages to the worst bleeding. Zhang weighs at least 180, maybe more, and the antenna will require careful leverage to lift without causing additional damage. Every moment of delay increases the risk that Japanese observers will spot them and call down artillery. How many you got out already?" Zhang whispers through gritted teeth. 16, you'll make 17. Jesus, Doc, 16 guys down that rope. The extraction takes nearly an hour. First clearing debris, then carefully lifting the antenna, while Zhang bites down on a folded bandage to muffle his screams. Finally, the agonizing journey back across open ground, Zhang's dead weight making every yard a small victory against exhaustion and fear. At the cliff edge, the rope tells its story in new ways. Frayed strands catch moonlight like silver wire, and the anchor point around the tree stump shows dangerous wear, where constant friction has carved grooves in both hemp and wood. Desmond runs his fingers along the line, reading signs of impending failure in every fiber. "This is crazy, Doc," Zhang mutters as they secure him in the harness. "That rope's gonna snap. We're both gonna die." Rope's held this long. Reckon it'll hold a little longer. But privately, Desmond shares Zhang's fear. The mathematics are simple and unforgiving. Each evacuation stresses the rope beyond manufacturer specifications, stretches it closer to catastrophic failure. 16 men have tested those hemp fibers, and the 17th may be one too many. He signals to the aid station below with a hooded flashlight, then begins the careful process of lowering Zhang into the void. The rope sings under strain, individual fibers snapping with sounds like distant gunshots. 3 times during the descent, the line jerks and settles, sending Desmond's heart into his throat as he imagines the whole system failing. But Zhang reaches bottom safely, and hands reach out from the darkness to transfer him to a waiting stretcher. The rope returns empty, lighter but more damaged, ready for whatever burden comes next. Alone now on the plateau, Desmond sits with his back against the tree stump and allows himself a moment of honest assessment. His aid bag contains 1 tourniquet, 1 morphine syringe, and a handful of bandages. Enough for maybe 1 more evacuation if everything goes perfectly. His hands shake with exhaustion, and dark spots dance at the edges of his vision. Somewhere in the distance, he hears the rumble of tanks moving along Okinawa's coastal roads, the eternal rhythm of war continuing while individual dramas play out on forgotten ridges. The 77th Infantry Division will regroup, resupply, and attack again tomorrow or the next day. Fresh ropes will be brought up, proper evacuation equipment distributed, lessons learned from tonight's improvised heroics. But tonight belongs to the darkness, the wounded, and a simple hemp line that has become something approaching sacred. Each strand represents a choice to preserve rather than destroy, to answer calls for help rather than ignore them, to trust that faith and physics can coexist for just a few hours more. From the crater field beyond the ridge, another voice rises above the wind, weak, distant, but unmistakably human. Desmond closes his eyes, offers a brief prayer, and adjusts his nearly empty aid bag. Just 1 more. Would you follow the orders exactly, or trust what your own eyes and instincts tell you in a moment like this? Comment which path you'd take, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. The rope trembles like a living thing as Desmond prepares for what he knows must be the final evacuation. Every fiber screams warnings about load limits and structural failure, but somewhere in the darkness beyond the ridge, Private Williams from 3rd Squad calls weakly for help, his voice growing thinner with each passing minute. Williams had been point man when the assault collapsed, and a Japanese knee mortar caught him in the open near their forward observation post. Now he lies in a shallow shell crater, both legs shattered, bleeding slowly into the coral dust, while enemy snipers wait for movement they can target. The journey across the plateau feels different this time, heavier somehow, as if the weight of 17 previous evacuations has settled into Desmond's bones. His aid bag contains exactly 1 tourniquet, 1 syringe of morphine, and 3 bandages. Enough for basic field treatment if everything goes perfectly, nothing left for mistakes or complications. Williams is worse than the others. Much worse. The knee mortar round had detonated close enough to pepper his legs with shrapnel, while the concussion left him drifting in and out of consciousness. Dark stains spread beneath him where major blood vessels have been severed, and his breathing comes in shallow, irregular gasps. "Doc," Williams whispers, his voice barely audible above the wind. Thought nobody was coming. "I'm here. We're getting you home." But even as he works, applying the tourniquet, administering morphine, packing wounds with his remaining bandages, Desmond knows this evacuation will test the rope beyond any safe limit. Williams weighs close to 200 pounds, and his injuries require a rigid stretcher that they don't possess. The improvised harness will have to support dead weight across 300 feet of open space, trusting hemp fibers already stretched to their breaking point. The return journey becomes a nightmare of stops and starts, Williams occasionally crying out despite the morphine, Japanese voices answering from hidden positions as enemy observers try to pinpoint their location. Twice they freeze in place while search parties probe nearby shell craters with flashlights and bayonets. At the cliff edge, the rope tells its story in moonlight. Individual strands separated and fraying, the anchor point carved deep into both hemp and wood by constant friction. Desmond runs his fingers along the line, reading signs of imminent failure in every twist of fiber. The mathematics are simple and unforgiving. This evacuation will almost certainly destroy their lifeline, leaving any remaining wounded stranded on the plateau. But Williams needs immediate surgery, needs blood plasma and proper facilities that exist only at the aid station below. The choice reduces to stark simplicity: risk the rope for one man's life or preserve it for wounded who might not exist. "This is it, Doc," Williams mumbles as they secure him in the harness. "Rope's gonna snap. We're both gonna die up here." Maybe, but maybe not. Sometimes things hold longer than they should. The evacuation begins like the others. Careful tension on the line, gradual transfer of weight from cliff edge to void. But Williams's bulk immediately stresses the rope beyond previous limits. Individual fibers snap with sounds like breaking guitar strings, and the anchor point groans ominously as additional load transfers to fewer and fewer strands. Halfway down, disaster strikes. A section of rope near the cliff edge separates completely, leaving Williams suspended on perhaps half the original fibers, while the remainder whip loose in the wind. For a terrifying moment, the entire system threatens to collapse, sending Williams plummeting into the rocks below. Desmond throws himself across the remaining line, using his body weight to secure the anchor point while reaching for the separated strands. His hands burn as hemp slides through his grip, and for several seconds, Williams hangs in space, supported by nothing more than prayer and physics. Then additional hands reach from below, medics and stretcher-bearers who heard the rope singing under strain and positioned themselves to catch Williams if the system failed completely. Working together, they guide him the final 100 feet to safety, while Desmond clings to the fraying lifeline above. When the harness returns empty, more than half the rope's strands have separated completely. What remains resembles string more than proper line, individual fibers held together by habit and hope, incapable of supporting anything heavier than its own weight. Desmond sits beside the destroyed rope and stares across the plateau toward the distant crater fields. Somewhere out there, other wounded men might be counting minutes, wondering if anyone remembers they exist. But their lifeline has finally reached its breaking point, physics overcoming faith after 18 impossible evacuations. The silence feels different now, heavier, more final. Without the rope, Hacksaw Ridge becomes an island surrounded by vertical space. It's wounded beyond reach of conventional rescue. 18 men have trusted their lives to hemp fibers that were never designed for such work, and 18 times the covenant held. In the growing dawn light, Desmond can see the full scope of the plateau: shell craters and scattered equipment, destroyed positions and abandoned gear. The 77th Infantry Division will return with proper equipment, organized evacuation procedures, lessons learned from one medic's improvised heroics, but the rope that made it possible lies broken beside him. Each strand, a story of faith, tested beyond reasonable limits and holding just long enough to bridge the gap between hell and hope. 3 days later, sitting in the aid station tent, while a doctor examines rope burns on his palms, Desmond finally tells someone what really happened during those final hours on Hacksaw Ridge. Not the version that will appear in after-action reports or citation paperwork, but the private truth that wakes him in the middle of the night with the phantom sound of hemp fibers snapping. "You know what nobody asks?" he tells Lieutenant Morrison, who's been promoted to replace their fallen platoon leader. "They don't ask how many times I almost quit." Morrison raises an eyebrow but doesn't interrupt. He's learned to listen when Desmond talks about the ridge, understanding that some stories need telling more than hearing. "First trip out, after I found Jenkins with his guts hanging out, I crawled maybe 10 feet before stopping. Just stopped." laid there in the mud thinking about how easy it would be to crawl back, tell everyone he was already dead. The confession hangs between them like smoke. Outside the tent, normal base camp sounds continue. Trucks arriving with supplies, men playing cards, someone reading mail from home. The 77th Infantry Division has moved on to other objectives, other ridges, but Hacksaw remains vivid in their memories. What changed your mind? The rope. Sounds crazy, but every time I tested those strands, checked the anchor point, felt like a promise. Like saying I'd trust it meant it had to trust me back. What Desmond doesn't mention, what he's never told anyone, is how many times that trust nearly failed. The moment with Williams when half the rope separated and he threw himself across the remaining strands, official reports call it quick thinking under pressure. But Desmond remembers the terror, the absolute certainty that Williams would fall and die because one medic had pushed improvised equipment beyond any reasonable limit. He remembers the voice in his head screaming that this was pride, not faith, that risking 18 lives on a fraying rope was arrogance disguised as conviction, that a truly faithful man would have stopped after the first evacuation, called for proper equipment, waited for organized rescue. "You saved 18 men," Morrison says quietly. "That's what matters." Maybe, or maybe I got lucky 18 times and called it divine providence. The doctor finishes treating his rope burns and moves on to other patients. Through the tent opening, Desmond can see the distant outline of Hacksaw Ridge, its plateau empty now, except for scattered equipment and Graves registration teams collecting bodies. Tomorrow or next week, another unit will assault those same positions with fresh ropes, proper evacuation gear, lessons learned from one medic's desperate improvisation. But tonight belongs to memory and questions that have no clean answers. In his pocket, Desmond carries a small section of the rope, 12 inches of frayed hemp that he'd cut away from the anchor point before leaving the ridge. Physical evidence of something that shouldn't have worked but did, 18 times in succession. The section shows every sign of catastrophic failure: separated strands, worn cores, fibers split and blackened by friction. Any engineer would pronounce it unsuitable for load-bearing work, dangerous beyond any safety margin. Yet somehow it held when men's lives depended on its strength. Later that evening, writing letters home, Desmond struggles to find words for what happened on the ridge. How do you explain faith tested beyond reasonable limits? How do you describe the weight of responsibility for lives hanging 300 feet above rocks and darkness? His mother will want to hear about divine protection, miraculous intervention, prayers answered in battlefield darkness. His father will ask practical questions about tactics and equipment, lessons learned for future operations. Neither version feels complete. The truth occupies some middle ground between miracle and mathematics, a place where fraying rope fibers hold precisely as long as needed, where stubborn faith and desperate improvisation combine to bridge the gap between death and safety. 18 times the Covenant held. The 19th attempt would have failed, physics finally overcoming hope, but by then all the wounded had been found and lowered to safety. "You think about going back?" Morrison asks, settling beside him with his own letters. "After the war, I mean, making sense of it all." Desmond touches the rope section in his pocket, feeling the rough texture of hemp worn smooth by friction and stress. 18 men trusted their lives to these fibers, and 18 times the trust proved justified. But he knows that 19th evacuation would have ended differently, that they pushed their improvised lifeline exactly as far as physics allowed. Don't reckon it needs making sense. Sometimes things hold when they should break, and sometimes that's enough. In the distance, artillery rumbles as other units engage other objectives. The war continues its relentless advance across Okinawa's coral ridges, consuming men and equipment with mechanical efficiency. But somewhere in the aid station below Hacksaw Ridge, 18 soldiers are alive because one medic refused to abandon them and one rope held longer than any reasonable person should have expected. The official citation will mention conspicuous gallantry and devotion to duty. It will not mention the terror, the moments of doubt, or the private knowledge that they succeeded by the narrowest possible margin. Those details belong to memory, not legend. 40 years later, Desmond sits in his modest Virginia home, holding a section of hemp rope, while a young historian asks careful questions about Hacksaw Ridge. The fiber feels different now, brittle, faded, but still recognizable as the lifeline that bridged hell and hope during those desperate hours on Okinawa. "How many men did you actually evacuate that night?" the historian asks, tape recorder running. Official records show some discrepancy in the numbers. 18. Could have been more if we'd found them in time. Could have been fewer if that rope had snapped earlier. The young man nods, making notes about heroism and faith under fire. He's writing a book about Medal of Honor recipients, stories of extraordinary courage in impossible circumstances. But Desmond suspects he's looking for the wrong kind of story, something clean and inspirational, suitable for school textbooks and Memorial Day speeches. The real story resists that kind of packaging. It lives in the tremor that still affects his hands during thunderstorms, in the way he tests rope and cord with obsessive attention to frayed fibers. It surfaces in dreams where he hears voices calling "medic" from darkness that stretches beyond any rope's reach. The citation mentions divine protection. Do you believe God intervened that night? Desmond considers the question while studying the rope section. 40 years of memory have worn some edges smooth while sharpening others. He remembers the terror more clearly than the courage, the moments of doubt more vividly than the prayers. Reckon God was there, same as He's everywhere. But that rope held because good men in a supply depot somewhere made it right. Those wounded lived because other soldiers carried them when they couldn't walk. Divine protection, maybe, but it looked a lot like ordinary people doing more than they thought they could. Through his window, afternoon rain beats against glass with a sound that still sometimes wakes him at 3 a.m. On those nights, he'll find himself in the kitchen, testing the strength of clothesline or measuring the load-bearing capacity of cabinet hinges. Old habits from a time when such knowledge meant the difference between life and death. The historian wants to know about the other men. Morrison, who died at Shuri Castle 2 weeks later. Williams, who lost both legs but returned home to Alabama. Zhang, who became an engineer and named his first son after the medic who saved his life. 18 evacuations, 18 different stories of survival and loss, courage and consequence. Do you stay in touch with any of them? Christmas cards mostly, wedding invitations, funeral notices more often now. What he doesn't mention is the letter he received last month from Williams's widow, describing her husband's final words about a rope that shouldn't have held and a medic who wouldn't abandon the wounded. Or the call from Zhang's son, wondering if Desmond might speak at his father's memorial service about events on a ridge 40 years gone. The historian asks about motivation, about the decision to keep returning to the plateau after the perimeter withdrew. These are questions Desmond has answered countless times, at veterans' gatherings, church services, Medal of Honor ceremonies. The public answers have grown smooth with repetition, duty, faith, love for fellow soldiers. But the private truth remains more complicated. He returned because the rope demanded it, because each strand represented a covenant between the living and dying that couldn't be broken as long as physics allowed. He returned because voices calling medic from the darkness required answering, regardless of personal cost or reasonable risk. Any regrets about that night? Desmond hefts the rope section, feeling its weight against his palm. 40 years have passed since Hacksaw Ridge, 4 decades of ordinary life built on the foundation of those extraordinary hours. He'd worked as a carpenter, raised a family, attended church services where people occasionally recognized his name and asked for war stories. Wish we'd had proper equipment. Wish those boys hadn't been wounded in the first place. Wish Morrison had made it home to see his daughter grow up. The interview concludes with predictable questions about modern warfare, current conflicts, lessons for new generations. The historian packs his tape recorder and promises to send a copy of the finished chapter. Desmond nods politely, knowing the published version will smooth rough edges, transform confusion into clarity, make legend from memory. After the young man leaves, Desmond returns to his kitchen table and spreads out the rope section like a map of vanished country. Each strand tells stories that will never appear in official histories. The weight of responsibility that settled across his shoulders like a pack, the mathematics of fiber strength and human weight, the moment when half the rope separated and 18 evacuations nearly became 18 deaths. Outside, the rain continues its percussion against window glass. Somewhere in the sound, he can almost hear voices calling from darkness beyond any rope's reach. But tonight, sitting in his quiet Virginia home, he knows that 18 times the covenant held, 18 times faith and physics proved sufficient to bridge the gap between earth and sky, between death and morning. In his pocket, the rope section waits patiently, 12 inches of frayed hemp that once held the weight of the world, now serving as reminder that sometimes ordinary things endure longer than anyone expects, and sometimes that endurance is exactly enough. The legend belongs to history books and Medal of Honor ceremonies, but the memory, the weight, the fear, the stubborn faith that kept him crawling across that plateau remains his to carry, light as hemp fiber, heavy as 18 lives trusted to his hands and one impossible rope that held precisely as long as hope required. If this story reminded you that behind every medal there's a human being carrying memories we'll never fully see, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.